welcome everyone. We're here with the Deschutes Public Library to have a fantastic author reading. So thank you for joining us. And if you have any questions throughout the program, questions for Karen should go in the chat. Here on the screen in front of you, you should see a kind of a welcome to our virtual program screen. And we're going to get started right now. So it's timing momentarily. I use the chat feature to ask questions. You all are muted, and we ask that you stay that way throughout the presentation. But we also have the Q&A, which is for if you can't hear me right now, if something gets dropped, let us know, let me know. Use the Q&A, and I will be here on the back end throughout the whole program to make sure you get the full experience. We are currently recording this program, so if you walk away and you say, this was amazing, I wish so many more people could join us, they can. This video will be available 1 week from today. It'll be up on the Deschutes Public Library website. Just how you found this event, our events calendar, the link will be up there in a week. All right, so that's the nuts and bolts of it. I am going to introduce Karen, and then she's going to take it away. She'll be doing a reading, and then there will be time for question and answer. So put questions for Karen in the chat as we go through. All right, Karen Thompson Walker is the New York Times bestselling author of 2 novels, The Dreamers, which has been optioned for television by Fox 21, and is a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice pick, and The Age of Miracles, which was a finalist for the Barnes & Noble Discover Award, an Indie's Choice Award, and a Goodreads Choice Award, and was named one of the best books of the year by Financial Times, Publishers Weekly, People, O, the Oprah magazine, and Amazon. Her work has been translated into 27 languages. Her TED Talk about fear and the imagination has been viewed more than 2 million times. She is an assistant professor of creative writing at the University of Oregon. She lives with her husband and 2 daughters in Portland, Oregon. And I should mention her latest book, The Dreamers, was also a finalist for the Oregon Book Award this year. So congratulations on that too. All right, Karen, I'm going to stop the share. I'm going to let you take it away. We're so grateful you're here, and we'll begin.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor and sort of a treat to get to do something like this, even though there's so many things that we can't do right now. Okay, so I'm gonna read from the start of my novel, The Dreamers. And then my favorite part of these kinds of events is the question and answer time. So I'd really just encourage you to, if you have questions, feel free to ask me anything that interests you. Thank you. 1. At first, they blame the air. It's an old idea, a poison in the ether, a danger carried in by the wind. A strange haze is seen drifting through town on that first night, the night the trouble begins. It arrives like weather, or like smoke, some say later, but no one can locate any fire. Some blame the drought, which has been bleeding away the lake for years and browning the air with dust. Whatever this is, it comes over them quietly. A sudden drowsiness, a closing of the eyes. Most of the victims are found in their beds. But there are some who will tell you that this sickness is not entirely new, that its cousins have sometimes visited ours. In certain letters from earlier centuries, you may find the occasional reference, decades apart, to a strange kind of slumber, a mysterious, persistent sleep. In 1935, 2 children went to bed in a Dust Bowl cabin and did not wake for 9 days. Some similar contagion once crept through a Mexican village, El Niente they called it, the nothing. And 3,000 years before that, a Greek poet described a string of strange deaths in a village near the sea. They died, he wrote, as if overcome by sleep, or, according to a second translation, as if drowned in a dream. This time it starts at the college. It starts with a girl leaving a party. She feels sick, she tells her friends, like a fever, she says, like the flu, and tired, too, as tired as she has ever felt in her life. 2. The girl's roommate, May, will later recall waking to the sound of the key turning in the lock. May will remember the squeak of the springs in the dark as her roommate, her name is Kara, climbs into the bunk above hers. She seems drunk, this girl, the way she moves so slowly from door to bed. But the room is dim, and, as usual, they do not speak. In the morning, May sees that Kara has slept in her clothes. The narrow black heels of her boots are sticking out beneath the blankets of the upper bunk. But May has seen her do this once before. She is careful not to wake her as she dresses. She is quiet with her keys and with the door. May leaves only the lightest impossible impression on this space, the comfort of not being seen. This is California, Santa Laura, 6 weeks into May's freshman year. May stays away from the room all day. She feels better this way, still stunned by how quickly it happened, how the friendships formed without her, a thick and sudden ice. Each evening, Kara and the other girls on the floor stand in towels in the bathroom, blocking the sinks as they lean toward the mirrors to line their lips and eyes. May can hear them laughing from the desk in her room across the hall, their voices loud above the hum of the blow dryers. It takes time to get to know people, her mother says over the phone. Sometimes it takes years. But there are certain stories that May has not told her mother. Like those boys who came to the door the first week of school. There was a bad smell in the hall, they'd said, and they'd tracked it to this room. It's like something died in here, they'd said, walking in without asking, filling up the narrow room, flip-flops and board shorts, baseball caps low on their heads. The boys got excited when they began to sniff around May's desk. That's it, they'd said, pressing their hands to their noses. It's got to be something in there. They'd pointed to the bottom drawer. What the hell do you have in there? It was her mother's dried cod, which had arrived in the company of 3 bars of dark chocolate and 2 lavender soaps. My mom makes it, she'd said. This is one of her mother's few inheritances from her own mother, May's grandmother, the only one in the family born in China and not San Diego. It's fish, she'd said. She knows that these boys refer to her as quiet girl, as in, hey, quiet girl, it's okay to talk. She does not think of herself that way, as especially quiet, but there she was, as if under their sway, suddenly not talking. Jesus, said the one named Tom, who was taller than the others and plays basketball for the school team. He'd tied a red bandana around his face like a worker in a Civil War hospital. That is foul, he said. Every time she remembers it, that bandana over his mouth, May's face turns hot with the shame of it. In the end, she dropped the bag of cod down the trash chute at the end of the hall, 10 floors down, the scrape of plastic on tin, while the boys gathered around her to make sure. I didn't know they'd be like that, Kara said later. This is how she learned that Kara was the one who told the boys about a smell in the room, though she'd said nothing at all to May. This is one of the reasons that May spends her afternoon at a campus cafe, where, on this particular day in October, she waits until she is sure her roommate and the other girls will be gone from the floor, their hair dryers quiet, their flat irons cool, and the girls themselves enmeshed by then in the complicated rituals of their sororities. The boys, she hopes, will be at dinner. But when May gets back to the floor that night, 9 hours after she left it, she finds a note, written in red, on the whiteboard that hangs on their door. We're leaving, it says. Where are you? These words, it is obvious, are meant for her roommate. When May unlocks the door, she finds Kara still lying where she left her that morning, her body curled toward the wall in the top bunk, her black boots still protruding from the sheets. Kara, she says softly. Outside, the sun is sinking. The sky is clear and turning pink. May switches on the overhead light. Kara, she says again. But Kara does not wake, not to the sound of May's pleading or to the louder voices of the 2 paramedics who soon detect, through her badly wrinkled dress, that she is breathing, at least, that she still has a pulse. Kara sleeps through the screaming of the other girls as they see the way her head rolls back against the stretcher, the way her mouth hangs open, her brown hair falling loose across her face. She sleeps through the screeching of the crickets in the pine trees outside and through the cool night air on her skin. May stands barefoot on the sidewalk as the paramedics slide the stretcher into the bright bubble of the ambulance. A little roughly, thinks May. Be careful, she wants to say. and then the doors swing shut without her, leaving May alone in the street. The paramedics will later report that the girl sleeps through the wail of the siren, too, and the flashing of the lights. She sleeps through the bumps of the potholed streets as the ambulance rushes toward St. Mary's, where, after several attempts, 2 doctors find that they cannot wake her either. On the other floors of the hospital that night, women labor while the girl sleeps. Babies are born while she sleeps. She sleeps while an old man dies in a distant room, an expected death, his family gathered, a chaplain. She sleeps through sunrise and she sleeps through sunset. And yet, in those first few hours, the doctors can find nothing else wrong. She looks like an ordinary girl, sleeping ordinary sleep. There will be some confusion later about what happened to her there, how her heart could have slowed so much without setting off the monitors. But this much is known to be true. Over the course of many hours, her shallow breaths turn gradually shallower. It is hard to say afterward why the final beats of her heart go unrecorded by those machines. 3. The girls. They cry, and they do not sleep. They sit around in their slippers and their sweats on the hard carpet of one another's rooms. They hold hands. They drink tea. If only they had checked on her sooner, they think. If only they had listened when she said she felt sick. They should have known is the feeling. They should have done something. Maybe, they think, they could have saved her. The boys turn quiet and they drink even more. Cheap beer bought with fake IDs. They keep their hands in their pockets those first few days and just try to stay out of the way of the girls. It is as if the boys can sense it, even in those girls, in their easy closeness and their interlocking arms, the whole history of women and suffering, the generations of practice at grief. To the girls, it feels wrong to get dressed. It feels wrong to wear makeup. Hair goes unwashed and legs go unshaven and contacts float untouched in solution. They wear glasses, it is then revealed to the boys. More than half of those girls wear glasses. Her poor mother, the girls say to one another, their knees clutched tight to their chests, as if the shock has turned them even younger. They picture their own mothers. They imagine the phones ringing in their own kitchens back home, in other towns, in other states. Arizona, Nebraska, Illinois. I can't imagine it, the girls say to one another. I just can't imagine. The funeral is in Kansas. It's too far to go. We should do something for her parents, says one of the girls. They're coming the next day, the girls have learned, to collect Kara's things. We should order flowers, they say. The girls all agree right away. There is an intense desire to do the proper thing. This feels like their induction. Suddenly, here is life, cut right to its center. Here it is, dismantled to its bones. They settle on lilies, 24 in white. Everyone signs the card. They can think of nothing else useful to do, but a certain yearning persists. Meanwhile, a new generosity flows between them. How small their other concerns begin to seem, how meaningless compared. Fights end and slights are forgiven, and 2 of the girls reconcile by phone with the faraway boys who they loved so much in high school and who they had thought, until now, they'd outgrown. But still the girls want something more. They long to be of use. When May walks down the hall, her arms crossed and her head down and her black hair pulled tight into a braid, the girls notice her as they have never noticed her before. She shouldn't blame herself, they all agree. None are sure of her name, the Chinese girl or maybe Japanese who lived in the same room as Kara. There is no way she could have known that Kara needed help. We should tell her that it's not her fault, one of them whispers. We should tell her that she shouldn't feel bad. But they stay where they are. Does she speak English, says another. Of course she does, says another one. I think she's from here, right? Somewhere from another room, there floats the smell of microwave popcorn. No one is going to class. The basket of lilies arrives that afternoon, but it is less than the girls had hoped. unable in the end to accomplish what they had wanted, which is to convey what they can say in no other way, something essential for which they do not know the words. Kara's parents. Their faces are pale and hollowed. She is a woman in a gray sweater. She is Kara with different skin. The father wears a beard and a flannel shirt. He is a man who 30 years earlier might have been any one of those boys of the floor, slouching in a doorframe, his hands in his pockets like theirs, unaware of what is waiting up ahead. Slowly, they begin to pack their daughter's things. The girls grow shy at the sight of them. They hide out in their rooms, afraid to say the wrong thing. For a while, the only sound on the floor is the harsh crack of packing tape, torn from its dispenser, or sometimes the clinking of emptied hangers, the soft slip of dresses being packed into boxes. Watching those parents from afar, the girls are quick to mistake all the ordinary signs of midlife, those wrinkles in his forehead, those dark circles beneath her eyes, for evidence of grief instead of age. And maybe, in a way, the girls are right. Those faces are proof of the passage of years, and it is the passage of years that has led them right here to this task. The voices of Kara's parents are hoarse and wispy, as if they were the ones who were sick. Once, a sudden gasp comes from the mother's throat. "Stop it, Richard," she says, and she begins to sob. "You're ripping it." This is the moment when May peeks out at the parents, as if watching from a great distance, which, in a way, she is. The father is struggling to roll up one of Kara's posters. It's Paris, black and white, tacked to the wall with pushpins, and bought, May knows, from the campus bookstore the first week of school. So familiar has the poster become to May that she has begun to associate Kara with the girls in the photograph, laughing and glamorous on a cobblestone street in the rain. "Just stop touching it," the mother says to the father. "Please." After that, the father is quiet. May lingers in the hallway. She should introduce herself to these parents. That's what her mother would say. But there is something unbearable about the way that man looks out the window, so like May's own father would, and how he doesn't seem to know where to put his hands. It is in the way he keeps touching his beard, the way he stands so silently in the corner of that room. May hurries back to her new room without speaking to them. Only Caleb is brave enough to approach Kara's parents. Caleb, tall and skinny, brown hair and freckles. Caleb, the English major, a little more serious than the other boys. The girls watch him shake hands with Kara's father. They watch the way he holds his Cubs cap at his side while he speaks to Kara's mother. And the girls, every one of them, long to smooth his hair, which is sticking up on one side and sweaty from where the cap has been. The girls love him right then for talking to those parents. They love him for knowing what to do. Caleb helps the father carry the boxes out to the elevator, and any stranger who passes them might think they understand that scene. Here is a father helping his son move out of a dorm. I'm going to read a little shorter piece from a little later, although I've just realized I don't have the copy of my book that I usually read from, so it's just going to take me one moment to find the space. Okay. Yeah, okay. Actually, I only skipped ahead a little, but it's a shorter section. And then I'm really looking forward to any questions you might have. What a terrible thing going on at the college. This is the way the people of Santa Laura talk about it in the aisles of the hardware store and the supermarket, or as they walk their dogs in the woods. "Have you heard what's happening at the college?" they say to their neighbors over fences and in the bleachers at the high school, as if the college were an island apart from the town, its gates impenetrable, even by germs. A sleeping sickness, that's what the local reporters are calling it. One girl is dead, another unconscious, both from the same dorm floor. There is a drought fanning out all across California. No rain in 90 days, and they are behind already from the year before. No one has ever seen the lake in Santa Laura sit so low, or the sandbars rising in the middle like dunes, the old dock standing dry 50 feet from the water's edge. It's the worst drought in 100 years, or longer, some say, 500 maybe, or more. But the weather, this weather, it's glorious. 6 weeks of sunshine in a row. It does not seem possible to suffer in weather like that, as if beauty were a spell that could ward off death. But they know the grapes are dying in the valley below, and their lawns are going browner by the day, parched by the same sun that is warming their porch swings long into October. And yet somehow the disbelief holds. It does not seem possible in weather so pleasant for an 18-year-old girl to die. But Santa Laura is a place that has suffered before. This land is prone to shaking. These hills are liable to slide. And this forest is so fertile for fire that the cautious few among them keep their family photos packed in duffel bags at their front doors in case of the sudden need to flee. The tribe that once roamed these woods for game was ravaged by smallpox from fur traders, and a party of pioneers once starved in these mountains. 10 years after that, the first wooden houses, built when the silver was found in the hills, were drowned with 3 feet of snow melt that very first spring. You can still find the proof in the antique store at the corner of Mariposa and Klein. Photographs of women in dark dresses, the men in frayed coats, and those children, so serious, so spindly, standing knee-deep in the water, their eyes, the eyes of those accustomed to tribulation. A landslide later swallowed every bungalow on the east side of town, and the tiny city hall with its dome and its bell is only a replica of the first one. An earthquake cracked the walls of the original. The first cemetery, long since closed to new arrivals, is packed with the dead of Spanish flu. Some say their ghosts still roam the mansions on Catalina Street, now shabby and subdivided for students. The people of Santa Laura had known it was coming, that flu. They'd heard word of it traveling west from town to town. They tried to block the one road into town, but the sickness got in anyway, and then it spread like news. Twice as many people died of that flu here as in the next town over, leading some to suspect back then that Santa Laura was cursed. The idea still sometimes surfaces in certain superstitious minds. Whenever a teenager drowns in the lake or a hiker goes missing in the woods, some in Santa Laura wonder if this is a land destined for catastrophe. What if misfortune can be drawn to a place, like lightning to a rod? I think I'm gonna stop there, but I really would love to answer any questions you might have. And thank you again for listening and for being here.
Yes, thank you, Karen. That's fantastic. I always enjoy hearing from the author read their own work to really, when I go back and read it again, be able to hear your voice in the work itself. I think that's a really great experience. So thank you for that. That's fantastic. Spooky, but fantastic. Okay, so we'll get started with some questions. As if anyone else has more coming through, just send them through the chat. Try to pick them up as they come in. Okay, so we're gonna start. Just dive right in. This sickness that comes to the college could almost be considered kind of a pandemic of sorts. How does your reading change or your interpretation of the text change, considering you're now living through one?
Yeah, it was. I mean, this has obviously been a very strange, and terrible time for all of us. But there was this extra layer, especially at the beginning, extra layer of strangeness or sort of uncanniness for me, having done a bunch of research and written and imagined a scenario where a mysterious new sickness suddenly started to spread in contemporary America. And I guess I didn't read the most sort of uncanny parts, but there were details that I forgot I even put in, which was like the stores ran out of face masks. That was just like a quick detail later, it's mentioned in the book. And then that happened, and you know, people at one point in my book, people who are separated, like the people who are the sleeping sick are separated, and the relatives try to, or at least one relative tries to go and see his wife through a window just to be able to see her at least, even though she's unconscious. And then that happened. He, you know, especially with like nursing homes, you know, at the beginning there was a picture of relatives trying to sort of visit their family members in nursing homes just by looking through the window. So anyway, there were just like a few details like that that just felt really strange. But I think really that's like, it's sort of, it's has less to do with my imagination and more to do with history. And, you know, these kinds of contagious diseases and outbreaks that lead to pandemics, they do unfortunately follow on certain tracks. And so it's sort of like the research that I did from previous, like, you know, I did a lot of research about the 1918 pandemic. And so I feel like it's really the research I did into history that made it so that some of the details in my book kind of lined up with what really has happened. And then in obviously many ways, it's totally different. And one thing I noticed that I thought about a lot at the beginning is that I made a choice, like I made an artistic choice to keep the this mysterious sleeping sickness just in this one town. And I made that because I wanted there to be like an intimate quality to it, and so that I could focus on one town and what the experience of this one place was like. But I also feel like there's some kind of analogy between the choice that I made, where I was like, I was going to keep it in this one town because it was sort of easier to wrap my head around, easier to kind of deal with as a like an author. But in the same way that it would have also been easier for the world if this had remained, if we could have kept it in one place. Like it's just. Obviously just the complexity of a global pandemic and how it's a little different in every place. There's like a strange analogy to the complexity that I sensed for why I, as a novelist, chose not to try to account for an entire world's pandemic. But yeah, it's just in general been a sort of a extra strange experience.
Definitely. Has any of this, okay, so you write speculative fiction. How is it to then live through what could technically be your next book? How is it to live through almost a speculative fiction world? Do you gain inspiration, or are you weary with the whole thing beyond just COVID burnout?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think in some ways some of my research gave me a sort of false sense of understanding because I did learn a lot about viruses, and I feel like my research, what I took away from my research was that the scariest known diseases out there, like they could cause pandemics, or at least, I mean, pandemic is technically when it goes across the whole, you know, to a certain number of countries where it's around the whole world, but at least sicknesses that could cause an outbreak of something. The scariest ones to me are some that have a much higher fatality rate. But so that at the beginning, when there was like early information about what the rate of danger with per individual person, like if you get this sickness, you know, what your likely statistical prognosis is, I thought it sounded a little less scary than like the terrible research I had done, and you know, like Ebola or all these other things where the fatality rate could be above 50%, you know, or even 100%, close to 100%. Anyway, but what I really failed to understand was how frightening and important the contagiousness would be. Like it's not just how dangerous it is for each individual person, but it's like once it can just spread to so many millions of people. That is really a big part of the danger that I didn't fully, as a novelist, I hadn't quite arrived at. I think, and at the same time, I think a lot about how I probably wouldn't write the story. Like I wouldn't have written a story about what we're facing, because I like in my fiction to set it in contemporary America, but have like some kind of flicker of like wonder. And so that's why, like for me, the sleeping sickness, like it is an epidemic story, or a potential epidemic story, an outbreak story, a virus story, and there are some tragic outcomes in the book, but at the same time, it kind of, I was able to visit this like sort of territory of wonder, in a way that I feel like the harsh reality of COVID-19 is not, it's like a little too just darkly realistic, if that makes sense. So I probably wouldn't have written, even if I could have imagined it, this exact scenario. So in that sense, it feels different than my imaginative space.
Yeah. And what you just said there, the element of wonder that you bring in, I mean, that's one of the main descriptors for your first book, your debut, The Age of Miracles. People say it's full of wonder. And so speculative fiction, that's a great avenue for getting to explore basic human truths, but not through the harsh lens of reality, just like you said. How did you decide that that was what you wanted to write? Are you working on a speculative fiction right now, or are you branching into something different? Like, what do you consider the basic foundation of your writing? Why do you write? What is it you want to bring to people?
Well, let's see. I guess I started off focused on more realistic stories. I mean, like as a student, like in college and graduate school, and I really kind of discovered my interest and fell in love with speculative fiction and the possibilities of it when I read Blindness by Jose Saramago, which I just kind of mention all the time. But that's a story about a contagion of blindness. So everyone in a town goes blind, or almost every single person goes blind within a few weeks, and then chaos ensues. But I was really struck by that book because it just showed me how kind of serious and philosophical a book could be while also having this really like imaginative premise that's outside of our regular reality. I think I had a bit of a like serious college students like bias against, a serious English major students bias against like fantastical stories. I thought I was like, I want to write about, like, it's more serious to write about something real, and that book really blew my mind and changed my mind. And I really, for me, using a speculative premise is a way of actually getting at our reality from a sort of tilted perspective. And that's what I love about it, like to be able to actually be writing about human nature and our real contemporary reality, but it's easier to see, I think, for me and maybe for the reader, what's interesting or what's valuable about our ordinary experience when through this tilt of a speculative premise. So I think that's what draws me to them. And what I'm working on now is not so much a disaster story, so it's a little different in that sense, but it does have another speculative element and a kind of territory for like mystery and wonder. And the kind of unknowable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. We'll hopefully get to hear more details about that soon. I'm definitely in need of more reading right now. So you mentioned that you talk about human nature in your work, and there are a lot of different characters in your book, all expressing kind of a different side of human nature. So when you have a story with so many characters, how do you weave them together?
Well, that was one of the most challenging things about going from my first book to my second book, because the first book, The Age of Miracles, it's really, it's told from the point of view of a woman looking back in very close detail on her childhood when this apocalyptic event happened. And so in that case, and I also, she's not exactly me, but I drew a lot on my own, at least, feelings of childhood, even though the facts are pretty different. So I feel like there was something a lot more natural, or something that came kind of naturally to me, and to that voice, to having, the only thing the perspective was just an adult, a youngish adult looking back on childhood. And so it was easy to imagine that perspective and that point of view. And it was of someone who'd had a childhood in some ways. The ordinary parts of her childhood were kind of similar to mine. So there was a kind of an intuitive quality to that voice that was nice. And then with my second book, I really thought it'd be interesting, especially because I was writing about a contagious virus. I kind of wanted to have this like head hopping quality to different characters in a way that would maybe parallel the way the virus is spreading through a town. So I was interested from an early point of having multiple perspectives, but it really felt like a new tool I had to develop. I mean, I hadn't written a lot in the third person, and I hadn't done a book with multiple points of view. And I also I wanted it to move forward always. So it was hard to decide. Like I didn't want to show the same experiences from 4 different points of view or 5 different points of view. I mean, I broke that rule definitely once, maybe twice, but usually I wanted it to each chapter be like one person's perspective and telling some new, like going forward in time and furthering the story. So that balance, figuring out that rule was important, but then also that balance was tricky because sometimes there was something that was happening in the town that I wanted a certain character to experience, but then I had either already made the choice or was also interested in having another character experience it. So that was something to figure out, and kind of a new stretch for my imagination, I guess. But I do think that they probably all the characters that we get from like an interior perspective, there's some facet of my personality I put, and then of course they're different in lots of ways, but I think I kind of haven't quite figured out how to inhabit someone who is 100% different from me. Maybe that would be my next challenge, even though these people are different and their biographies are very different, but just like little parts of me are probably in most of them.
That's fascinating. Was that one of the more different or difficult or challenging aspects of moving from your first book to your second? Was it your writing process completely different between the two? Were there similarities? And not just in content, but in how you achieved it.
I mean, the process was different. I mean, one just kind of coming to figure out what the narrative voice could do was a big part of it for the Dreamers, which I guess I already talked a bit about. But also the process was different because my life was different. I mean, when I was writing my first book, The Age of Miracles, I was working in book publishing. I was an editorial assistant, and then kind of was working my way up to being a full editor. I was slowly writing The Age of Miracles during that time, and I would just write a little bit before work every day. And I would just aim for around an hour, but often it was less. So that a big part of my sort of memories of writing that book and my experience of writing that book was how I wrote it in these like little pieces, but almost every day, or at least every weekday. And so that was just really different, because then by the time I was writing The Dreamers, I had left my job, and I left New York for part of it because my husband went to the Iowa Writers Workshop. So, after I published my first book, so I started this book, The Dreamers, in Iowa, and then I had a lot of time. I mean, a lot more time than I had before, and so there was a window when I felt like I had tons of time to write. And then I had a baby, and then I had another baby. So the feeling of lots of time kind of went away. But so anyway, the process was really pretty different. But I think possibly that experience of how I wrote the first book, where I was used to writing a whole book just a little bit at a time and a little bit each day, I think probably served me well for figuring out how to write a book that, for example, while raising 2 kids or having while you have 2 babies or toddlers in the house.
Yeah, definitely. So your husband is also a writer?
Yes.
How is that? Is that challenging? How is it?
I mean, I think mostly it's really great. I mean, we met in college when we were taking some of our first creative writing classes. So it's kind of always been part of our relationship and our connection is, writing fiction, figuring out how fiction works. And so, it's just been built in. And now it's hard for me to imagine it's hard for me to imagine being married to someone who's not a fiction writer at this point. So yeah, I think it's great. I mean, certainly there are like certain, you know, writers and artists. It's like nobody is like the corporate lawyer in the family or the doctor who's like able to like pay all the bills all the time. You know, it's so, you know, we sort of figured out our life and our system, but maybe that'd be the one risk, or especially earlier on, we're like, who's the one who's going to be like the sort of stable one doing the job and, you know, getting the health insurance and paying the bills and stuff. And the answer is no, nobody is going to be. But we sort of, you know, we've worked it out. But that I feel like is the risk of two artists or two writers, or it's one of the risks being together. But mostly it's been great, and he's my first reader and I'm his first reader, and we're always editing each other's work, and it's just hard to imagine any other way.
Oh, that's great. I know some famous writer couples, and you hear all sorts of stories, but it's amazing that you two met in your writing workshops. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
So kind of speaking on like the family element, when you were growing up, did you always know you wanted to be a writer? And when you went to your kindergarten teacher or your mom and said, yeah, I'm going to be a writer, did you get, oh, well, you know, maybe what about being that corporate doctor or corporate lawyer, being a doctor? What about that? What was your experience there?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think when I was in elementary school, I really loved writing, and I maybe wanted to be a writer, and I entered writing contests, like fiction writing contests and stuff. But I definitely feel like then in high school, in high school, maybe the very beginning of college, I went through a feeling of like, oh, that's as if that can't be like a career, you know, like, oh, writing is like a fun thing, but now it's time to figure out what you're going to do for real. Like I did have that feeling for some amount of years. And I remember thinking like, well, maybe I'll major in English and go to law school. That was like I thought that's what I was going to do.
Yeah.
But when I got to college and I started taking creative writing classes, I really fell in love with like a new level, a more serious level, with trying to figure out how to write fiction. So I sort of rediscovered. Yeah, I think there was a period when I was like, oh, maybe I could be a journalist, which would be, you know, definitely have a certain creativity to it. But I was trying to like, and my dad, I remember suggesting like, oh, maybe I could do something related to like PR, because you need to write for that. Like, anyway, so I think there was a feeling of like, well, I better also figure out what my practical thing is. So I feel lucky that I've gotten to do. Now my practical thing is I teach creative writing at the University of Oregon, which is great, which has been, I think, really good. I mean, it takes some of my writing time, but I think it's actually really good for my writing. But I feel lucky that I have gotten to sort of find a way for my practical thing to actually still be pretty creative and related to writing.
Definitely, that's fantastic. So you talked kind of a little bit about like, was there any kind of individual spark that started this writing process for you, or was it books were always in my house as a kid, or mom dropped me off at the library all the time, so I was just always there. I was always a reader. Was there something like that for you?
That's a good question. I don't know that there was like the one thing. I mean, I loved reading and writing as a kid, but I actually wasn't. I was not that type, and I still am not, who will just like inhale just book after book after book after book, you know, like that actually never was me. And I think partly I'm a slow reader, so that there's a limit to it. Like I had a friend growing up who, she just loves reading. She loves books, but she also just loves reading as an act. And I feel like for me, as a kid and still, I love reading a book I love. Do you know what I mean? And I think there is something different about that. Like some people, of course, they prefer to read a book that they love, but they also will just, the act of reading, and especially maybe reading fiction, is just so pleasurable that even when they're like, oh, this is not really that good, but I'm still kind of into it because I just love reading, like almost in a kind of abstract way. I think for me, I love reading a book that I love, but I am kind of picky. and a slow reader. So as a kid, I don't know, I wasn't the kid who was just constantly with a book in my hand, but I was sort of deeply affected by the books that I discovered that I loved. And one that probably, like, rereading it with my daughter makes me realize that it maybe was an even more important influence than I really realized before, but is books by Roald Dahl, like The Witches and the BFG. And I think those books, like, they just really stayed with me, and it is sort of in a territory. I think what I hadn't really thought about before is it is sort of a similar territory in a way, where it's like more or less realistic world, like a sort of regular world, but there's something that we don't realize is going on, like that there's witches and they have witches conventions and they have these magical powers, or that there's this other world nearby or somewhere where giants come from and, like, you know, come into our world, like, and that, I think that kind of mix of the magical or the imaginative, like, coming into our reality really struck me and stayed with me in a way, sort of, related to what I like to write now.
No, I definitely can see that connection. That's great. So this can be a polarizing question for people to be asked and people to hear the answer. Are you ever willing to put a book down and walk away from it? Or do you have to finish? You said you're a slow reader and you can be kind of picky. So if you're in 100%, or are you just like, no, I can't waste my time with this? What do you think?
I put books down all the time.
Yes, okay.
I'm a major book putter downer. I mean, not put down, not in the sense of putting it down, but yes, that's another thing. I actually feel like I don't know that I have the best attention span. Like, I wouldn't put that as one of my, talents, is having a long attention span. But I think there is something kind of useful as a writer for that, because it's like I do, if a book is not, like, just working on kind of like every line, every page for me as a reader, then I start to be like, oh, I don't know if I really need to pick it up again. And that's a high, kind of unfair and ultimately idiosyncratic bar. But that's what I want it to feel like. I want it to feel like every single sentence is, like, pulling me. And not just, I don't just mean plot or story. I mean, like, that's part of it, but also just, like, some kind of energy or interest in language. Like, I just, anyway. And so I feel like that is not great. I don't think that's a great quality in me, but I try to use it, it can be useful as a writer, because then I start to be like if I'm getting a little bored or it's feeling a little slow, I'm quick to be like, I'm getting bored. And so then I cut it, or I shift to a new, like, tone or setting or whatever. And that doesn't mean that there aren't certainly going to be readers who don't like love the same things that I love, but I do feel like that I hope that I am writing books that are hard to put down, and I'm very in touch with what it's like to kind of have an urge to put it down. So.
Yeah, that's great. And I can attest, yes, impossible to put down until I get just a little bit too spooked, and then especially because I read before bed so often.
Yeah, that's another.
Okay, maybe not right now. So you mentioned Roald Dahl. He's great. Are there other authors that inspire you? And kind of in a similar vein, when you're writing, when you're actively working on a piece, can you read within your own genre, or do you have to read, I heard you mention before you're reading a nonfiction, just finished that. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I guess, let's see, other writers that have influenced me a lot, and that are favorites are, in college, Virginia Woolf was a major influence on me. I don't know that our writing has so much in common, but I just love her approach and kind of interest in language and in, like, small moments of a day. And that has always struck me. Marilyn Robinson, really love Jesmyn Ward. Julie Otsuka is another favorite of mine. I think she just is really incredible with language. And then Jose Saramago, especially Blindness, as I mentioned at the beginning. has been a big influence on me. And in terms of reading, I can read. I think I can read, and I can read fiction while I'm writing. Although I do also, the last, like the Dreamers in the book I'm working on now have involved, I have done more research for them than I did for the Age of Miracles. And it's become a part of it that I enjoy, where I'm just reading, you know, like the book I'm writing now has something a little bit to do with neuroscience. So I'm just reading everything I can find, especially for popular audiences on that subject. And so I mentioned before I was reading this book, Patient HM, about a guy who has really severe amnesia for, permanently for 40 years after he has this botched surgery, a botched lobotomy. Anyway, that's just a fascinating book, and I pick up all kinds of interesting little tidbits and details. So I have been reading a lot of nonfiction, I guess, lately.
I don't want to call your reading morbid, but I definitely think that it's cool to see how consistent you are with what fascinates you. Is there a book that people might be surprised that you love, or surprised that you've read? Is there just like a wild card out there?
That's a really interesting question. Well, let's see, a book that, two books that I love, but which are totally different from what I'm doing, are both by Sam Lipsyte, who actually was one of my teachers. But he, Homeland and The Ask, and especially like Homeland, they're both like very funny, satirical, first person. Like it's not what I'm doing.
Yeah.
As a writer, but I love reading, and maybe the only thing we would have in common is like an interest in like language, like, and like just editing and re-editing sentences, which I think for him, in Sam Lipsyte's work, it gives it this quality of like a density of kind of joke and insight that is really incredible, that I love. Yeah, I don't know if that's a great answer, but that's probably the furthest among books that I really love. It's probably the furthest from what I do.
So we have another question here. How do you handle writer's block? That's a big one.
I mean, I think, I don't know. I feel like writer's block is it kind of includes a lot of different problems in writing, and I think I guess so there's some version of it that I don't know that I like, just having no sense of what I want to work on. I don't know that I identify so much, because I love to just play with ideas, but I do get stuck very often. So that version of writer's block, I don't know, it's hard. I mean, you have to just know some days are going to be better than others. That's one thing. And then another thing that I do sometimes is like, I start backing up. I like to write in order, more or less. And so if I just get it to some kind of stuck place where I can't figure out what should come next, or I'm feeling like kind of not interested in where it's gone, then I start like retracing my steps and see like when was the last point that it felt like I was really felt kind of excited, or I knew what I was doing. And sometimes that means cutting whatever pages I've written and like pivoting a little from that, from when I retrace my steps back to where I was. And then I think reading always helps me too. Like reading, especially fiction, whether it's something that I know already that I love, like going back to a book that I love and reading that author's sentences or story, sometimes something new clicks in that sense, or just always having like new books around and new stories. I think that helps me too, because then I'll suddenly get an idea that I wouldn't have thought of on my own, where I'll think like, oh, maybe that's how I can introduce this character, or that's a way I could end the chapter, or those kind of things.
Yeah, definitely. So then we're kind of wrapping up here. So if you have any last minute questions, anyone, just feel free to put them in the chat there. So you could boil it down. One piece of advice that you would give other writers. Do you have one that just hangs out in your back pocket?
I mean, reading is obvious, just reading widely.
Yeah.
That's obvious. Maybe the other one is revising, especially like sentences, to just going over it over and over and over again. I think there can be a point, you also have to know your own habits. There can be a point for some people where that's not productive and they're just like pulling their work apart. But I think often like a few rounds of it that's just getting you closer and closer to your best work. And if you are interested in, trying to publish something, I just feel like doing all the work that you can do before you show it to some sort of professional is always going to serve you well, because it's going to be closer. Like they're still going to have suggestions or things they want you to change, but the more work you've put into it ahead of time, the better chance you'll have of it going forward.
So speaking of your own publishing experience, were there major changes that you took that you said absolutely not, or was it kind of just how it is? How close was the end product to what you brought them?
I mean, I have a really wonderful editor, Kate Medina, who is very rigorous. There's an idea of like, in publishing, like you might hear like editors don't edit anymore or something. I'm not sure where that comes from, because in my experience, there's a lot of editing in a good way. Like I know she's made my books better. Helps me make my books better. I don't know if it's drastically different, but it's refined on every level, and then one big change I made that was really thanks to my editor Kate, in the Dreamers, I added an entire character, like a whole thread, which when she first, it was like the type of thing where I thought I was like pretty much done. I mean, I knew we were going to edit, but I wasn't expecting to make major changes. And she said, she's like, I think you should consider adding one more character someone who is an outsider to the town, who comes to the town. And I just remember the first time I read that, the first day I was like, what? Like it took me 5 years or 4 years to come up, to choose the characters, to develop them, to figure out how they're going to work together. I can't possibly add another character at this late stage,
Yeah.
But then by the next day I was like, well, if I was going to add a character, I could maybe imagine it being a psychiatrist. And I was like, maybe like a woman who's a psychiatrist. And then by like the third day I was like, yeah, obviously I definitely have to add that character. So I thought that was interesting that she just sensed some kind of like ghost thread that was missing, maybe, I don't know. It doesn't mean it wasn't hard to do. It still was a lot of work to invent a whole new character and add her, but it really felt like, I feel really grateful that she sensed that it needed that.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And that's the kind of relationship you want with your editor, ultimately.
Yeah, and I'm lucky that I've got to work with the same editor for both of my.
Oh yeah, because that's not a guarantee.
No. In fact, editors do move around a lot, so it's kind of hard to. It's not that common necessarily, and authors move around too.
Yeah. Well, this has been great, Karen. Thank you so much for letting us take this time with you.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.